You're listening to The Coffee Hour. I'm Sarah Gulseth. Thanks to Concordia University, Wisconsin for your support of The Coffee Hour. You can find out more about Concordia University, Wisconsin at cuw.edu. Well, today, April 6th, is the Commemoration Day in the Church for artists Albrecht Dürer and Lucas Cranach. And I'm pretty excited to talk about artwork today, especially art of the Reformation. A whole lot of history and significance behind both of these men and the legacy that we still have today. Joining me to talk about both of these men is Dr. Daniel Harmelink, Executive Director of Concordia Historical Institute. Thanks so much for joining me today, Dr. Harmelink.
It's great to be here, and it's great that you've got a fantastic German little accent there for the names, too. So good job, Sarah.
All the singing diction comes in handy for pronouncing all these things. So we have these two artists, Albrecht Dürer and Lucas Cranach, today. Let's start at the very beginning. Why do we commemorate artists? A lot of times these days are for saints in the church or people that we hear about in Scripture. Why do we commemorate artists in the church?
Well, I always argue that fine art and music, these are fine gifts given by God to the church. And if we don't make use of them, and those who are artistically challenged or artistically gifted and are musically gifted, then shame on us. So one of the things, if you go into a Lutheran church, hopefully you'll see an expression of the Christian faith in visual arts, in music. So again, we don't have bare walls, or we don't believe that God's commandment against images pertains to, for example, what we'll talk about today is, portraits of the saints, and again, an expression of our Christian faith, the revelation of the prophets and apostles in visual arts. So people say, people visit a Lutheran church when I was serving in Southern California, and they say, boy, you do a lot of singing in this church. And it's like, yeah, and we also do a lot of, presenting of the gospel, of the Word of God in visual arts. So these people are important. I mean, they're part and parcel of the saints that have gone before us, and it's good to commemorate the artists as well as musicians in our church calendar.
Mm-hmm. And we'll get to the legacy of where we see their work today and how that ties into Concordia Historical Institute. We'll get to that in a little bit. But let's talk about the life and work of these men first. So they lived about the same time, didn't they? They're considered artists of the Reformation. Can you give us a little bit of the history of both of these men?
Sure. So Albrecht Dürer is probably the most famous, and his portraits and his both paintings and especially his engravings, his prints, are in museums all over the world. So he was swept up in this Renaissance, the 16th century Renaissance, and basically became a voice for the exciting things that were happening with the Lutheran Reformation. So although he was not baptized in the Lutheran Church, was not buried out of a Lutheran church, Albrecht Dürer was very sympathetic to the cause of Luther and the Lutheran Reformation. Luther, maybe once or twice, he met Frederick the Wise a couple times, and his portraits of Martin Luther and Frederick the Wise, Luther's prince, also Philip Melanchthon, Luther's right-hand man, are iconic 500 years later. He was incredibly gifted. And the images that we have of the reformers, many of them are prints and from the hand of Albrecht Dürer. He was in Nuremberg, though, which continued to be until the Reformation came to Nuremberg, a Catholic part of Germany. But the story is that when he heard that Luther had been kidnapped, this was after the Diet of Worms, when Frederick the Wise kind of instigated a kidnapping of Luther to keep him safe. When people heard that Luther had been taken or kidnapped, they thought of the worst, and it was reported that Albrecht Dürer wept when he heard Luther had been taken, because he feared for the worst and knew that without Luther, the cause of the Reformation, it was all on shaky ground now.
And what about Lucas Cranach?
Lucas Cranach he has a very interesting history. And again, if listeners have time to look him up and delve into the life of Lucas Cranach, it's remarkable. He was not only a fantastic artist, but he also wore multiple hats in Wittenberg. So he was at one time mayor of the city. He had many different business licenses. He was a fantastic businessman. He was the godparent to one of Luther's children, and was the kind of best buds with Martin Luther. So we know that he was, he lived in the same town, and the portraits of Luther were not only, historically accurate, right? But Lucas Cranach, through those portraits, we see Luther the reformer, Luther the pastor, Luther the doctor of theology. So without Cranach, I tell people, during the lifetime of Martin Luther and Katie von Bora, Philip Melanchthon, Frederick the Wise, the Cranach and his studio had a monopoly on these portraits, and they were in such high demand that he couldn't keep up. He had to enlarge his studios because so many people wanted to see visually who this crazy little monk from Wittenberg was, and his studio just couldn't keep up. So at the time of his eldest son's death, Hans Cranach, who died fairly early, it was announced at his funeral that he had painted 1,000 portraits of Martin Luther.
Whoa!
So even though Cranach, did have times to make sketches of the reformers, there was a Cranach studio in Wittenberg that basically had the lion's share of responsibility and opportunity when it came to, who was Martin Luther? What did he look like? Who was Katie von Bora, this nun that married to Martin Luther? And who was Philip Melanchthon that reformed the educational system in Germany? So without Cranach, we really would not know a lot about who these people look like, and what their personality, what their stature visually presented would look like.
Mm-hmm. That is amazing. What was the role of these artists in Luther's day? Very different from how we have fine art now. Yeah, what was that role for these artists?
So both for Dürer and Cranach, they would receive commissions to do their work. So they didn't just sit around and paint something and hope that it's sold at the next, garage sale. They were basically employed. For example, Cranach was employed by Frederick the Wise to be the court painter. And, it was a prestigious position, but it was a lot of work. So during the time that Martin Luther produced the 95 Theses, Cranach was busy basically illustrating the catalog of all the thousands of relics Frederick the Wise had collected, and were on view on that All Saints' Day. Luther nailed the 95 Theses the day before. Frederick the Wise was to display all of these relics that supposedly, if you venerated, you would get time off of purgatory. So everyone thinks that the 95 Theses was against Tetzel and against the selling of indulgences. But Luther did a very risky thing, because Frederick the Wise had one of the largest collections of relics in Germany, and he was personally, affected when Luther said the veneration, or these, you had to pay to get in to see these relics. So this, selling forgiveness or selling time off purgatory for viewing relics was also against Scripture. So Luther was doing a very risky thing with his 95 Theses. So Cranach was employed by Frederick the Wise. Again, he illustrated his catalog of relics. And then as the Reformation developed, Cranach saw fairly early on that the light of the gospel should also be reflected in things like altarpieces and portraits of the reformers and things like that. So he became, with the blessing of Frederick the Wise, became a painter of what the Lutheran Reformation was all about.
Mm-hmm. What would be some pieces that we would recognize from Cranach? I know there's lots of artwork from both of these men. What are some of the things that are recognizable for us today from Lucas Cranach?
So I think those listeners who are in the St. Louis area, I would say, if you have time, please come to the chapel at the International Center and see the altarpiece, the reproduction that is now over the altar. Cranach, again, he had to go through the process of kind of cleaning up his vision of the Christian faith as Luther kind of tore away these add-ons that the Roman Catholic Church had added. But that altarpiece shows very clearly, what the law is, what the gospel is, what the revelation of Christ in the Bible is all about, and the importance of the sacraments. That's all painted in there, and is very intense. So some artists that kind of go off into their imaginary world when they're doing art. But Cranach was more and more faithful as his career can develop, right, to clearly show what the Scripture teaches, what salvation is all about in a visual way. So I'd say the International Center, or there is now a movement to take Cranach's work and digitize it all. So if you go to Lucas Cranach, I think it's with a C, lucascranach.org, you can see this digital Cranach online resource. There are thousands now of paintings that have been digitized, and not only the paintings, but they have also taken special, like an X-ray machine or something like that, and you can see Cranach sketches underneath the painting itself to understand, how did he develop these paintings. But it's just a phenomenal resource, and I think the world is, even the unbelieving world is recognizing more and more the artistic gift that Cranach brought to not only the church but the community as well.
Yes, the altarpiece here at the International Center is beautiful. It's so great to be able to see that every day. And yes, if you're in St. Louis, come and look at it. Absolutely, come to chapel and look at that altarpiece.
Right.
We have more to talk about on the Commemoration Day of Albrecht Dürer and Lucas Cranach. We have to take a quick break. We'll be right back. You're listening to The Coffee Hour. I'm Sarah Gulseth.
At Concordia University, Wisconsin, we believe you were created for a reason: to use your God-given gifts to help others, to live a life of self-sacrifice in a me-first world, to live a life that's uncommon. Whether you're taking one of 50-plus online programs or learning with us in person on the shores of Lake Michigan, you'll be equipped to make an uncommon impact. Learn more at cuw.edu. Concordia University, Wisconsin. Live uncommon.
Welcome back to the Coffee Hour. I'm Sarah Gulseth. We're talking about the commemoration of Albrecht Dürer and Lucas Cranach today. These are both artists from the Reformation era. Dr. Daniel Harmelink joining me, Executive Director of Concordia Historical Institute, talking about art history. This is so fun to learn about some of the historical context of both of these artists. Before we went to break, we were talking about some of the work that we would recognize from Cranach. Now, what about Dürer? What works would we recognize today from
Dürer? Again, I think his portrait of Martin Luther, the portrait of especially the portrait of Philip Melanchthon is basically the standard. This is what Philip Melanchthon looked like for the last 500 years. So even the last big anniversary that Philip Melanchthon had was in 1997. They commemorated one of his either his birth date or death date, and the then West German Mint struck a 10 Deutschmark coin that basically that's Dürer's portrait of Philip Melanchthon. So not the most photogenic person in the world, but recognizable very quickly because of Dürer's work. So again, Dürer was the epitome of artistic, graphic talent at the time of the Reformation. And again, the printing press, I tell people, the printing press not only printed Luther's translation of the Bible, but it also printed more and more indulgences. It can be used for good and evil purposes too. So fortunately, the printing press was, this is what happened with the Cranach studio too. There was such a demand that they had to use prints or engravings because there you could do multiple impressions. An oil painting would take, days to do, and it's just, it's a one-off. So the printing press also spread the image of Luther throughout Europe and beyond. So in that sense, Dürer was the top dog as far as the the Reformation time, or the 16th century Reformation.
Mm-hmm. So Cranach was the court painter. What was Dürer's role as an artist? He wasn't employed by the court, was he?
Right. So he lived in Nuremberg, which was a free city, an imperial city. And his reputation was so big that, he would have multiple people asking for portraits or paintings or engravings and things like that. So he could pick and choose a little better than Cranach was basically under the orders of Frederick the Wise. But Dürer, he would have Christian sponsors of art, and then he would also have others too. So I think Cranach also kind of dabbled in that, as far as, he would do images from fables or from classic literature that had a resurgence in the time of the Renaissance or Reformation. But I think Cranach's career was much closer to the Lutheran Reformation than Dürer. I think, there are a lot of people who are non-Christians who don't give a lick about the Christian faith that, are fans of Dürer. Cranach's a little more Christian in his work, at least throughout his career, and in the career of his whole studio. His sons and those who followed him.
Yeah, what is that legacy of both of these men, but Cranach especially with his working so closely with the church? What was that legacy, his influence on other artists of his time?
Right. It's interesting. Sometimes we think these people 500 years ago were kind of dense, or they weren't as smart as we are now, but they still haven't figured out. We think of, mass production. We think of Henry Ford in Detroit, but Cranach faced the same thing. These portraits, these paintings of Martin Luther were in such high demand that he had his studio kind of crank these out in a standardized way. So today, most critics believe that he would have the studio, or people in his studio, maybe his sons or other people who were under his employ, basically do the paintings of Martin Luther and Katharina von Bora and Philip Melanchthon, but he would reserve to do the actual faith of the reformer. So how he did all of that, experts still don't know. So in the 16th century, there were more portraits painted of Martin Luther than any other person. It was that big a deal. And again, on a personal note, it's like, okay, out of high school, I was, I learned graphic art. So for me, the visual arts in the church are again, a good gift from God, and we can learn so much from them. So again, in the 16th century, some people didn't read. Mm-hmm. So Bible, even translated into German, you'd have to find someone who could read that to you in order to actually hear it. And the visual arts, again, we're so saddened with the fire at Notre Dame that a lot of the 16th century, middle age visual arts, it's either was lost or it's at high risk now. But for the common people, they would read the story of law, gospel, the scriptures, through what the stained glass and what the art of the church presented to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about Dürer? Did he have a similar legacy with the artists that he would have worked with and around at his time?
I'm sure he was an influence, but I don't think there's such a direct connection. Dürer kind of, again, he kind of followed where he could get his highest commissions, and kind of what the Renaissance was developing, or things like that. Mm-hmm. So I think for Cranach, the more he was exposed to Luther and the Reformation, the more Lutheran he became, and that's reflected in his art. Mm-hmm. And in the art and in the art of his son. So again, when he died, for example, there's an altarpiece in Gotha, I believe, or Weimar, I think, and it was begun by Cranach the elder, but finished by Lucas Cranach the younger. So you have to keep those guys, it's kind of like senior and junior. Mm-hmm. So the altarpiece was finished by the junior, by the son, and sometimes even Cranach would paint in his family or other people in Wittenberg into the backgrounds of these altarpieces. So it's kind of a detective work to see, maybe Cranach included himself in some aspect of these altar works. But again, they saw, even in the telling of scriptural stories, that this had a direct effect on their day and age, that the church continued. And I think sometimes we see that in Christian art today, that it's not only the saints that have gone before us, the prophets and apostles, but also the saints to continue to, be drawn into the eternal worship of Christ and his saving cross.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and both of these artists have work that if you go to an art museum, there's a good chance you're going to run across something from one or both of these artists. They're part of our art history, our art culture still today, even as Cranach was so heavily involved in the Reformation. You can still see his paintings. And I know there are some of his at Concordia Historical Institute too, aren't there?
Right. So we have two museums. One's at the International Center, and that's a permanent museum that shows the history of the Missouri Synod. We're celebrating the 175th anniversary of the Synod this year. Mm-hmm. So that's always good to come and experience and review. So at the CHI building proper, which is on the Concordia Seminary campus, we also have a museum exhibit hall. But we try to, like every year and a half, we try to switch that out and have a new exhibit. So right now, until June 1st of the summer, we're showing 50 portraits of the Reformers. And these are, Martin Luther and Katie von Bora, Philip Melanchthon, Frederick the Wise. And so these 50 portraits span the last 500 years. We're so delighted that one of the most recent donations to CHI is in fantastic condition print from a copper engraving of Albrecht Dürer, Frederick the Wise. And it's just in phenomenal shape, as I mentioned. So please come and see that if you've never seen a Dürer up close. Out of all the museum exhibits that we've had at the CHI on the Concordia Seminary campus, Dürer sets that we've previously shown. One, we have the set of the Passion of Christ. These are originals from the 16th century, and they're just in phenomenal shape. So if you've never seen one in person, I mean, there's great things to say about the internet, but going to a museum and seeing these things in person, there's nothing that can touch that. So we'd love to. We have Cranach portraits of Martin and Katie, Philip Melanchthon, and these will be up until June. Again, we can't put them on permanent display. It's not good for the art. So this is a very unique opportunity to see how in the last 500 years, all the different ways that the Reformers have been portrayed, and how even artists today have to work off the preliminary or the initial work of Cranach to get their bearings. So these two artists continue to be reflected in the art even today.
If people are interested in finding more about Concordia Historical Institute, where should they go? Where can they find information about you?
Sure. So our website is it's all spelled out, concordiahistoricalinstitute.org, where the building is open Monday through Friday, 8:30 to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Just if I'm in the building, I'd love to give you a special tour of the portraits. And feel free to give us a call, send us an email, and just show up. But please do that before July 1st so that you don't come and half of them are taken down and put back in safe storage. Oh.
Absolutely. Dr. Harmelink, thank you so much for joining me today on the Coffee Hour to talk about Albrecht Dürer and Lucas Cranach.
Blessings, Sarah. Thanks again, and we'll commemorate together the good gifts given by God through these two artists.
Absolutely. You're listening to The Coffee Hour. I'm Sarah Gulseth.
The Coffee Hour with Andy and Sarah is a production of KFUO. To support the Coffee Hour and KFUO Radio, visit KFUO.org. You can also text KFUO to 41444 or send an email to gifts@KFUO.org. And you can call us at 800-844-0524. KFUO. Christ for you, anytime, anywhere.